From as far back as I can remember, my father always said I was too beautiful to really be his, as if my blonde hair and blue eyes were some kind of proof that my mother had done something wrong, even though she never had. He treated me not like a daughter but like a living accusation, a reminder of something he imagined but could never prove. When he finally told me he wouldn't walk me down the aisle unless I agreed to a DNA test, I was hurt, but also tired of carrying this shadow, so I said yes. What I didn't expect was that the results wouldn't just clear my mother's name. They would turn my entire life upside down by proving that I wasn't his child and not even my mother's either. What we later uncovered about the hospital where I was born shocked everyone so deeply that my father actually dropped to his knees in front of more than 60 relatives. But all of that started 6 weeks earlier, on a quiet Sunday evening at my parents' large, carefully maintained house in Fairfield, Connecticut, the kind of place my father loved to brag he had built with his own hard work. The dining room looked perfect as always, with expensive furniture and spotless dishes my mother cleaned every week, as if keeping everything shining might somehow keep the peace. My grandmother sat at the end of the table watching my father closely, my older brother avoided everyone's eyes, and my mother held her napkin like it was the only thing keeping her steady. Then my father calmly said he would not come to my wedding, and the room went silent. He pulled a paper from his pocket and slid it across the table, saying he refused to walk another man's daughter down the aisle until the truth was settled, and when I looked down, I saw it was a consent form for a DNA test, and in that moment, I had no idea I was about to discover that my entire life story had been built on a lie. His signature was already waiting at the bottom of the page, and with a calm that felt rehearsed, he told me I had 6 weeks to take the test and show the results. To the whole family, promising that if I truly was his, he would come to the wedding and even apologize, though the cold smile on his face made it clear he didn't believe that outcome for a second. My grandmother's teacup hit the saucer with a sharp sound, my mother quietly broke down in tears, and I just sat there staring at the expensive watch on his wrist, thinking about how he'd been preparing for this moment my entire life. I didn't sign the paper that night, and I didn't make a scene either. I simply thanked him for reminding me who he was and said I wouldn't forget it, and I meant it. The truth was, none of this shocked me because by the time I was 28, I knew his cruelty followed a pattern as steady and predictable as the tide. I was 7 when I first realized I was different, standing outside my parents' door and hearing him accuse my mother while pointing at my hair and eyes like they were proof of something ugly. When I was 12 and wanted to join the school volleyball team, he refused to sign the form, saying he wouldn't spend money on someone else's child, while my brother got new sports gear without question. At 18, Marcus went off to university with every expense paid, but when I got into nursing school he told me to find my real father to cover the cost, so I worked long hours, took out loans and finished my degree with a mountain of debt and no help from him at all. The hardest part wasn't even the money. It was watching how he used me as a tool to hurt my mother, turning every argument, every small disagreement, into another chance to accuse her and reopen the same wound. And the night before I left for college, my grandmother pulled me aside and told me to keep every single paper from the hospital where I was born, gripping my wrist like she was trying to protect me from something I didn't yet understand. Keep your birth certificate, every hospital paper, every scrap of proof, my grandmother had told me that night, her voice serious in a way that only made sense years later. And although I didn't understand her then, I listened, and 18 years after that I finally learned why. After the dinner with my father, I drove back to my small Hartford apartment, a modest one-bedroom filled with second-hand furniture and sheer determination, where Nathan was waiting for me on the couch, his laptop open to client floor plans and 2 glasses of wine already poured. He knew the moment he looked at me that something was wrong, and when I told him about the DNA form, the ultimatum and the 6-week deadline, his jaw tightened a little more with every word. "Maybe you should just do it," he said at last. "Take the test, prove him wrong and end this forever." I set my glass down, looked at my simple ring, the one he had designed himself from a sketch I once drew, and told him quietly that this wasn't about proving Gerald wrong anymore, it was about finally setting my mother free. He went silent because he knew what I meant. 5 years earlier, my grandmother had called me in the middle of the night to say she'd found my mother in the bathroom with an empty bottle of pills, and although the paramedics arrived in time, it had been far too close. Since then, my mother had been rebuilding herself piece by piece with therapy and medication, while Gerald never once apologized or admitted what decades of suspicion had done to her. He just kept insisting he was right. She had given him 35 years of loyalty, and he had paid her back with nearly 3 decades of doubt and cruelty. That night I looked up an independent genetics lab I had researched long before, certified, discreet and completely unconnected to him, and decided I would take the test but on my terms. 2 weeks later, on Gerald's 60th birthday, the whole family gathered at the Fairfield Country Club, with its perfect green lawns overlooking the water and a private dining room full of people celebrating the man who had made my mother's life so small. I wore a simple black dress. Nathan squeezed my hand as we walked in and whispered, 2 hours, as if we were counting down to something much bigger than a party. We thought we could make it through 2 hours, but we were wrong. About halfway into the dinner, after several glasses of expensive wine, Gerald stood up to give a speech, thanked everyone for coming, proudly talked about Marcus and his success in finance, and even raised a toast to my mother for her patience, before his gaze slowly shifted to me. "I see my daughter is here tonight," he said, putting so much emphasis on the word that it felt like he was mocking it, and a few relatives laughed awkwardly. He went on about how he hoped I had been thinking seriously about our last conversation and about proving where I truly came from, and the entire room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Marcus tried to stop him, half rising from his chair and saying this wasn't the right moment, but Gerald brushed him off, smiling that familiar cold, sharp smile and saying that family should always be honest with each other. Then he launched into a cruel comparison, talking about birds that leave their eggs in nests, saying such eggs may look beautiful but don't belong there and never did. Someone gasped behind me, someone else laughed nervously, and my mother stared down at her hands while tears fell onto the bracelet he had once given her after one of their worst fights. I slowly set my fork down, stood up and felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward me. "Thank you for the reminder, Gerald," I said calmly. "I won't forget it." Then I turned to my mother, took her hand and asked if she wanted to step outside for some air, and together we walked out past the whispers, past the stares, and past the man who had spent 28 years trying to break us both. In the parking lot, my grandmother hurried after us, her heels tapping sharply against the pavement, and when I turned I saw Eleanor Whitmore, 78 years old, proud, straight-backed and always sharp-eyed, looking at me with a kind of urgency I had never seen before. She had never liked Gerald and had always said he was a small man with a loud ego, and now, after glancing back to make sure he hadn't followed, she leaned closer and said quietly that there was something important she needed to tell me. She took a slow breath and said there was something she should have told me years ago, then guided us to a quiet bench overlooking the golf course, where the setting sun washed the sky in soft orange and pink and made everything feel strangely unreal. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, my grandmother said that the night I was born at St. Mary's Hospital, something didn't feel right. I felt my mother tense beside me as Eleanor explained that when the nurse brought me in to show my grandfather while he was still alive, both she and my mother were there, and the nurse looked panicked, her hands shaking as she rushed through it, passed me to Diane too quickly and nearly ran out of the room. My mother's voice broke as she said she had never been told any of this, and my grandmother admitted she had tried to get answers later, calling the hospital and asking questions, only to be brushed off and told everything was normal and that the records were sealed. Then Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a faded copy of my birth record, explaining she had made it before everything was locked away. I stared at the time printed on the page, 11:47 p.m., and my mother said quietly that she had given birth at 11:58 and remembered it clearly because the doctor had joked about me almost being born on a leap day, which meant there were 11 minutes that didn't make sense, 11 minutes where something had happened. My grandmother said there was also a name on the record, the head nurse on duty that night, Margaret Sullivan, who had retired years ago, and she still had her address. The very next morning I walked into the Gene Trust office in Hartford with 3 DNA samples. Mine from a simple cheek swab, my mother's given to me the night before with tears in her eyes and a steady voice telling me that no matter what the test said I would always be her daughter, and my father's taken quietly from a few hairs on the brush in the guest bathroom he always used when he stayed over. The technician, a composed woman named Dr. Reyes, explained the process, the timeline and the confidentiality, and I paid extra to have the results rushed, though my grandmother insisted on covering it. Later that afternoon I finally worked up the courage to call Margaret Sullivan, and after several rings an older, slightly unsteady voice answered, and I introduced myself and said that I had been born at St. Mary's Hospital on March 15, 1997. I told her I believed she had been the head nurse on duty that night, and before I could even finish my sentence she cut me off, her words tumbling out in a rush of fear, saying she couldn't help me, didn't know what I was talking about and that I should never contact her again, and then the line went dead. I stared at my phone for several seconds, feeling the weight of that silence, until Nathan looked up from his drafting table and asked what had happened, and I told him she'd hung up, not calmly, not confused, but panicked, and that was when I knew she was hiding something, because an innocent person would have asked questions, not fled. Margaret Sullivan was scared, and whatever had happened in 1997, she had been carrying it for nearly 3 decades, and now that burden had found its way to me. 3 days later, Gerald made his next move, and he didn't even try to be discreet about it. He sent an email to the entire extended family, 47 people in total, including aunts, uncles, distant cousins, and people I barely remembered, with my mother, my grandmother, and me copied for everyone to see. I read it sitting in my car outside the hospital after my shift, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, and the subject line alone made my stomach drop. Regarding Tori's wedding. In the message, he wrote about how he had suffered in silence for 28 years, how he had lived with doubts about my parentage, how my mother had supposedly refused to admit the truth, and how he had asked me to take a DNA test and make the results public, claiming my hesitation proved everything, and until it was settled in front of the family, he would not attend the ceremony and hoped everyone would understand his position. He even attached an old family photo from my christening, one I remembered from my grandmother's shelf, showing me as a 3-month-old baby in my mother's arms, pale, blonde, and blue-eyed, surrounded by Gerald, Marcus, and a crowd of dark-haired relatives, and he had actually circled my face in red and written, "Spot the difference." The replies started coming in within hours, some defending my mother, most just asking careful, curious questions, drawn to the drama more than the truth. That night, Marcus called and told me to just do what Dad wanted, saying I was making everything worse and damaging his reputation, and I actually laughed and asked if that was really what he cared about, his reputation, and he hung up without answering. Then, exactly 3 weeks after I had submitted the samples at 9:47 p.m., the email from GenTrust finally arrived. The results came in on a quiet Tuesday while Nathan was away on a work trip in Boston that couldn't be moved, and I was alone in our apartment with a half-finished salad on the table and a movie playing that I wasn't really watching. The email subject was cold and formal, something like, "Your DNA results," and after entering my password and confirming my identity, I opened the file and had to read it 3 times because my mind refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. It said I had no genetic connection to Gerald, which I had already prepared myself for, but then I saw the next line and my whole body went numb, because it said I also had no genetic connection to my mother, and for a moment I honestly forgot how to breathe. Not his daughter and not her daughter either. I called the lab right away, my voice shaking, and a technician patiently explained that there were no errors, no mix-ups, and no chance the results were wrong, which meant the science was clear and final. That proved my mother had never betrayed anyone and that my father had been wrong about that for nearly 3 decades. But it also meant something far more confusing and painful, because if she hadn't done anything wrong, then how could I not be her child? I ended up sitting on the kitchen floor, staring at the ceiling, realizing that for 28 years my father had accused her of something that never happened, and even though he was wrong about the reason, he had been right about one thing without knowing it. I wasn't his daughter, and now I didn't know whose daughter I was. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house and arrived at a time when I knew Gerald would be out and my mother would be in her robe, sitting in the sunroom with her tea, and the moment she saw my face, she knew something was terribly wrong. I handed her my phone, watched her read the report, watched the color leave her face as she went over the numbers again and again, and when she looked up she kept saying it had to be wrong, that she carried me, that she went through hours of labor, that she held me in her arms and knew I was hers. I took her cold hands and told her I believed her, and that was when the truth became clear to both of us, because if she was telling the truth, then there was only one possible answer left. Something had gone wrong at the hospital. The only possible answer was that someone had switched the babies, and the silence between my mother and me felt so tight it could break at any second. Then she suddenly remembered the time, saying the papers showed 11:47, but she clearly remembered staring at the clock through the worst of the pain and knowing I was born at 11:58, and she had always wondered why those numbers never matched. Just 11 minutes, and yet those few minutes had quietly rewritten 2 lives without anyone knowing. I told her gently that if I wasn't her biological child, then her real daughter had to be somewhere in the world, grown up now, living a life that was never meant for her, and that thought finally broke her in a way I had never seen before. She didn't cry softly like she used to when Gerald hurt her with words, but in deep, shaking sobs, and through them she kept saying we had to find both girls and set things right. I want to pause here and say this. If you've ever felt like you didn't quite fit in your own family, like something about your life never made sense, you're not alone. And this story is far from over because the truth is about to get much more complicated. Now let me tell you what happened next because Gerald found out about the test before I could get ready for it, thanks to Marcus who saw the confirmation email on my mother's phone during a visit. And less than an hour later my phone rang and I knew it was coming. Gerald didn't even say hello, he just asked if the results proved him right. And I stayed quiet because I didn't know how to explain that he was both right and wrong at the same time, and my silence was enough for him to celebrate. He actually laughed and said he had waited 28 years to be proven right, and that now everyone would finally see the truth. And when I asked if my mother knew, he said of course she did and that she was probably crying while trying to invent excuses. I could hear him walking back and forth, almost excited, saying he would send another message to the whole family with proof and expose her once and for all. And before I could stop him or explain that she had never lied and that something much bigger had happened, he ended the call, already convinced he had won. Less than an hour later, Gerald called my mother and coldly told her to start packing, saying he wanted her out of the house by the end of the month because he was finished with what he called her lies. And my grandmother came over right away and refused to leave her side. When I arrived that evening, I found my mother folded into the couch like she had no strength left, while my grandmother stood nearby like someone guarding a fragile treasure. And when I quietly said that Gerald thought he had finally won, my grandmother looked at me with that sharp, steady look and said that it was time to show him the full truth, not just the part he liked. The next 3 days felt heavier than anything I had ever lived through, and I even thought about canceling the wedding not because of him, but because I couldn't stand the idea of my mother's name being cleared in the middle of flowers, music and forced smiles. But Nathan wouldn't hear of it and told me firmly that our life would not be put on hold because of my father's behavior. Still, I couldn't move forward without answers, and those answers were trapped inside Margaret Sullivan's silence. So I called her again and again, 5 times in 3 days with no reply, and on the 6th call I left her a message telling her I had real, legal DNA proof that a baby had been switched at St. Mary's Hospital in 1997 and that I wasn't trying to accuse or punish anyone, only to understand who I really was. But if she stayed silent, I would involve lawyers and force the truth into the open. 2 hours later, my phone finally buzzed with a message from an unknown number telling me to meet her Thursday afternoon at a small diner in Bridgeport and to come alone. And as I stared at the screen, I realized that whatever she had been carrying for nearly 3 decades was finally about to be spoken. The Riverside Diner looked like a place forgotten by time with worn booths, old music and tired coffee. And there she was in the corner, small and nervous, her gray hair tightly pulled back and her hands shaking as she held her cup. And when she looked up at me, I knew this was the moment everything was about to change. She looked at me for a long second and then said softly that I looked exactly like her, like Linda, my biological mother, with the same hair and the same eyes, and my heart seemed to miss a beat as I asked how she could possibly know that. And Margaret closed her eyes as if bracing herself before admitting she had been carrying this secret for 28 years. Waking up and going to sleep with it, always wondering if staying silent had been the biggest mistake of her life. She reached into her bag and pulled out an old, worn notebook, her work log from the night I was born, and slid it across the table, and as I read her tight, careful handwriting, a cold weight settled in my chest, because it listed 2 baby girls born 11 minutes apart, one to my mother and one to a woman named Linda Morrison, and then in the middle of the page, it described how a trainee nurse had mixed up the babies after their baths and how the mistake was discovered hours later, but instead of fixing it, the hospital leadership decided to change the records instead of changing the children, claiming it would be less painful for everyone. When I looked up at her with shaking hands and said they had known and still covered it up, she nodded with tears in her eyes and said they had already threatened her job, her future, and her family if she spoke, and she had been young, scared, and trapped. When I asked who the other baby was, she showed me a printed profile of a woman my age with brown hair, warm eyes, and a smile that looked painfully familiar, and told me her name was Rachel Morrison and that she was the real daughter of the woman who raised me. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at Rachel's profile online, reading about her life, her job as a teacher, her quiet, kind-looking smile, and thinking how easily that could have been my life instead. And after writing and deleting the same message over and over, I finally sent her a careful, nervous note telling her that we were born in the same hospital on the same night and that there was something important she deserved to know, even though I had no idea if she would ever believe me. That I wrote to her and explained that a recent DNA test had shown I wasn't biologically related to either of the parents who raised me, and that after speaking to a nurse from the hospital, I had learned 2 babies were accidentally switched, and that according to everything I had found she was likely the real daughter of Diane and Gerald, while I was the daughter of Linda Morrison, and that I had documents and a witness but wanted nothing from her except to give her the truth and the choice to talk if she wished. I sent the message, added my phone number and closed my laptop before fear could stop me, then spent the next day checking my phone every few minutes like a nervous teenager, until the next evening when it finally rang and a hesitant voice asked if I was Tori, and something in that voice felt strangely familiar. She told me people had always said she didn't really look like her parents and that her father used to joke the hospital must have made a mistake. And this time she laughed and cried at the same time because suddenly it wasn't funny anymore, and we talked for hours until we both agreed to do another DNA test, this time comparing her results to Gerald and Diane, with the timing set to have answers just before my engagement party. During the following days I prepared everything carefully, collecting my original test results, copies of the nurse's old records, and a signed statement from her admitting what had happened and saying she was finally done being afraid, and Rachel sent in her samples using the same fast process. My grandmother agreed to be there, the nurse agreed to come and sit quietly until needed, and Rachel waited nearby, because by then I wasn't just hoping for the truth anymore, I was ready to finally put it in front of everyone. "Are you sure about this?" Nathan asked quietly as we reviewed the plan, the weight of confronting him publicly pressing on both of us. I thought about my mother, about the night of the pills, about 28 years of lies, of being called a cheater, a cuckoo's egg, about every cruel word my father had thrown at her and at me. "He wanted a public reckoning," I said, my voice firm. "He sent that email to 47 relatives. He humiliated me in front of the whole family. This time there's no private escape. Everyone who believed him needs to see the truth." Nathan nodded slowly, understanding the gravity, then smiled faintly. "Then let's give them a show they'll never forget." 3 days before the engagement party, Rachel's DNA results came in. 99.97% match with Gerald Townsend, 99.98% match with Diane Townsend. I read the numbers over and over, tears streaming down my face, then called her immediately. We met the next day at a Starbucks halfway between Hartford and Springfield, neutral ground for 2 women whose lives had just been flipped upside down by science. She was already there, seated in a corner, 2 untouched lattes in front of her. When she saw me, she stood so fast her chair almost tipped over. For a long silent moment, we simply stared, brown eyes and hair, a jawline I'd seen in Marcus 1,000 times, the familiar dimple on her cheek, and me, blonde hair, blue eyes, fair skin, the living mirror of Linda Morrison's photos. We were strangers who should have been sisters. Sisters raised by the wrong families, I whispered. She laughed, I laughed, and soon we were hugging in the middle of Starbucks, crying into each other's shoulders while the baristas looked the other way. "I want to meet them," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Diane and Gerald, my real parents." "You will," I promised, though I didn't tell her that one of those parents would be on his knees when she finally walked into the room. The engagement party was held at the Whitmore estate, my grandmother's Georgian manor, rose gardens in bloom, fairy lights twinkling through century-old oaks, a space she insisted on to keep Gerald's ego powerless. 60 guests arrived that evening, all elegantly dressed, family, friends, and every relative who had received Gerald's accusatory email. I wore a navy blue dress, carrying myself with quiet triumph, Nathan at my side, his hand resting on the small of my back. My mother entered with my grandmother, eyes still red from days of crying, yet her posture straighter than I had seen in years, lighter, freer. And then Gerald arrived. He arrived late, of course, fashionably late as he liked to call it, letting the crowd settle, letting anticipation build like a wave about to break. Tom Ford suit sharp, Rolex glinting under the chandelier, a smug smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, he moved through the room as if this were his victory lap. Handshakes, congratulations, nods of approval from relatives who still believed his carefully spun version of events. "Such a difficult situation," an aunt murmured. "You've been so patient." Marcus hovered beside him, uneasy but obedient, the dutiful son he had always been. In the corner, Margaret Sullivan sat quietly, a trembling glass of water in hand, decades of guilt and fear etched into her posture. And just beyond the connecting door, Rachel Morrison waited, silent and tense, poised for the moment she'd been preparing for without knowing the exact timing. I checked my phone. Nathan nodded. It was time. Midway through the cocktail hour, Gerald cleared his throat and asked for a microphone. The room hushed as he stepped onto the raised platform, adjusting his jacket, smiling like a king addressing his subjects. "First, I'd like to congratulate Nathan," he began, voice smooth, practiced. "A brave man marrying into this complicated family." Nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Then his gaze found me, cold and calculating. "But I think we all know why I'm really up here. There's been a lot of speculation lately. I asked Tori to take a DNA test. I know she did. What I don't know is why she's been hiding the results." Silence fell, thick and suffocating. With a flourish, he pulled a folded paper from his jacket, letting the anticipation stretch. "My son was kind enough to share a copy." Gerald unfolded it slowly, theatrically, as if savoring the moment. 0% genetic match with Gerald Townsend. 0% genetic match with Diane Townsend. Gasps rippled through the room. My mother gripped Eleanor's hand, white-knuckled, her heart hammering. Gerald's voice rose, fury and vindication tangled together. 28 years. 28 years I've told everyone something wasn't right. And now the science proves it. He turned to my mother, eyes blazing, face twisted with decades of resentment. "You lied to me, Diane. You lied to everyone. And now the family knows exactly what kind of woman you really are." The room went utterly still. Then I walked forward, measured, deliberate, calm, and took the microphone from his stunned hand. "You're right, Gerald," I said evenly, voice carrying across the hall. "The DNA test shows I'm not your biological daughter, and I'm not Mom's biological daughter either." Gerald's smirk widened for a heartbeat, thinking he still controlled the room. But as the truth sank in, as eyes darted between me and my mother, the smirk faltered. Confusion, shock, disbelief rippled through the family, because this wasn't about an affair. It was about everything he had been wrong about for 28 years. I turned to face the crowd. Every single one of the 60 relatives who'd received Gerald's accusatory email, every whisperer who'd cast doubt on my mother for decades. "Let me introduce someone," I said, nodding toward the side door. Rachel stepped through, 28 years old, brown hair, brown eyes, jawline unmistakably Townsend, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had no idea she had just rewritten history. Murmurs rippled across the room. A champagne glass clinked to the floor. Marcus let out a strangled noise and dozens of eyes widened in shock. "This is Rachel Morrison," I continued. "She was born 11 minutes before me at St. Mary's Hospital on March 15, 1997. The night I was born, there was an accident. A trainee nurse mixed up 2 babies after bathing them. The hospital covered it up to avoid a lawsuit." I tapped my phone and the wall-mounted display flickered to life, showing the Gone Trust reports. Rachel's DNA. 99.97% match with Gerald Townsend, 99.98% with Diane Townsend. "She is your biological daughter, Gerald. The daughter you've been searching for. She's been living in Massachusetts her entire life because of a hospital's mistake." Gerald's face went white. His eyes locked on Rachel and I could watch 30 years of certainty crumble into disbelief. "This is Margaret Sullivan," I said as the head nurse rose from her corner seat. Margaret's voice shook but was resolute. "Mr. Townsend, I was there. Your wife never betrayed you. Never. The hospital made us sign NDAs, threatened our jobs, our pensions. I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner." Gerald gripped the edge of the platform, knuckles white as the weight of truth pressed down. "You wanted science," I said, holding the microphone steady. "Here it is. Every document, every signature, every 11 minutes that changed 2 families forever." And at that moment, standing on the stage with Rachel beside me, I felt something I hadn't known in 28 years. Vindication, not for me but for my mother, for every tear she'd cried, every false accusation she'd endured, every sleepless night spent wondering if her husband would ever believe her. Gerald Townsend, who had spent decades certain of betrayal and righteousness, finally understood the scale of his error. He looked at Rachel, the stranger who carried his blood, and something inside him shattered, leaving only stunned silence in its wake. He stared at the DNA results on the screen, the cold numbers that had confirmed his suspicions about me but obliterated everything else he'd believed. And then he saw Margaret Sullivan, trembling yet unwavering, whose testimony had finally unspooled 28 years of lies. Gerald Townsend, proud, arrogant, certain, collapsed onto the platform like a marionette whose strings had been severed, one knee hitting the hardwood first, hands slapping the floor as his chest heaved in ragged gasps. I didn't know, he whispered, voice raw. How could I have known? I stepped closer, calm but unyielding, my eyes locked on the man who had made my childhood a battlefield. You could have trusted her. You could have investigated. You could have looked for another explanation instead of punishing the woman who loved you for a crime that never happened. Genetics are complex. Mistakes happen. But you chose suspicion. You chose cruelty. For 28 years, you punished Mom and me for nothing. From across the room a chair scraped back. Marcus, always silent, always compliant, stood not to defend his father but to walk straight to our mother. Mom, he said, voice cracking. I'm sorry. I should have said something years ago. Diane's tears soaked into his shoulder as she hugged him tight, a lifetime of fear and hurt finally spilling out, while Gerald remained on his knees, watching his family choose each other over him. For 28 years Mom had lived in his shadow, enduring every accusation, every cruel remark, crying herself to sleep countless nights, swallowing the poison of his suspicion, always hoping somehow that one day the truth would set her free. Now the truth filled the room, glowing on screens, printed on paper and reflected in the face of a young woman who carried Diane's blood. She stepped forward at last, her heels tapping softly against the hardwood as the crowd parted without a word, even Marcus moving aside. She stopped in front of Gerald, who was still on one knee, his face wet with tears I had never seen him shed. 28 years, she said, her voice calm but unbreakable. I stayed because I loved you. Because I believed one day you would trust me. Because I thought our family was worth fighting for. Gerald tried to speak but she lifted a hand and stopped him. Not yet. You don't get to apologize in private. You owe me an apology in front of everyone who read that email. You owe Tori an apology for every birthday you ruined, every milestone you ignored, every time you made her feel like she didn't belong. Then she gestured toward Rachel. And you owe her an apology for being the father she should have had but never did. His shoulders shook as he cried and my mother's voice finally broke. I didn't need the world to believe me. I needed you to believe me and you never did. She turned away from him and walked to Rachel, her hands trembling. Hello, she said through tears. I'm your mother. I'm so sorry it took so long to find you. It took Gerald 3 tries to stand and no one helped him. He clutched the edge of the platform, lifted himself up, and when he spoke into the microphone his voice was barely recognizable, stripped of every trace of pride. I was wrong, he said, 3 words that were 28 years too late. I was wrong about Diane. He never betrayed me. I accused her for almost 3 decades and I was wrong. Then he looked at me and for the first time in my life there was no suspicion in his eyes. Tori, I took things from you I can never give back, your childhood, your trust, and I'll repay your student loans, all of them. It's not enough, but it's a start. Finally he turned to Rachel, his daughter, a life he had never known, and his voice broke completely as he said he didn't know how to make up for missing her first steps, her graduations, and every single day of her life. His voice broke, raw and trembling. That's something I'll regret until the day I die. Rachel was crying now too, though she steadied herself enough to speak. We can start now, she said quietly. If you're willing to actually be a father instead of a judge. Gerald nodded, speechless, as my grandmother stepped forward and handed him a tissue, her sharp eyes unflinching. Clean yourself up, Gerald, she said, her tone firm. You have a lot of work ahead of you. A week after the engagement party, I drove to Springfield, Massachusetts, to meet my biological mother. Her home was a modest colonial with white siding, blue shutters, and a garden of wildflowers clearly nurtured with love. A far cry from my grandmother's estate or Gerald's grand Tudor-style mansion, but warm in a way those places never were. Linda Morrison opened the door before I could knock, and seeing her felt like staring into a mirror of my future. Blonde hair streaked with silver, blue eyes identical to mine. Tori, she whispered, her voice catching. I've been staring at your pictures all week. I kept thinking I was dreaming. She pulled me into a hug that smelled of lavender and something ineffably like home. We sat in her kitchen for hours, sharing photographs, stories of her childhood and my biological grandparents, and the life I might have lived if a trainee nurse hadn't made a mistake. She told me about her late husband, David, my biological father, who had died 3 years ago, never knowing Rachel wasn't his daughter. He used to joke that Rachel had old soul eyes, Linda said, dabbing at tears. Now I understand. They were your eyes, Tori. Always your eyes. I showed her pictures of my own childhood. The blonde baby in a house full of brunettes, the girl who never fit, the woman who had finally found the reason why. I don't want to replace Diane, Linda said softly. She raised you. She's your mother. I agreed. But maybe there's room for one more. Linda's smile could have lit the entire house. I'd like that, she said softly. I'd like that very much. 2 months later, I married Nathan Miller in the rose garden of Whitmore Estate, under strings of fairy lights, surrounded by family, the one I had been born into and the one who had raised me. My mother walked me down the aisle. Not Gerald. My mother. She wore a champagne-colored dress, her posture straight, her steps steady, radiating a strength I hadn't seen in decades. Beside her, I wore a Vera Wang gown insisted upon by my mother and grandmother, the kind of dress that made the day feel as significant as it truly was. Gerald sat quietly in the second row, diminished and silent. He didn't protest when I told him he wouldn't be walking me down the aisle. He didn't argue when I explained that this was my mother's moment, not his. He simply nodded and said, I understand. It was a start. Rachel stood with my bridesmaids wearing a deep green dress that highlighted the brown in her eyes. The eyes of our mothers, the eyes of Gerald. Over the weeks since the engagement party, she had been slowly meeting the town's family. Tentative lunches, careful conversations, the fragile beginnings of a connection that had been denied to us for 28 years. Linda Morrison sat in the front row, a place of honor. She caught my eye and waved, her own gaze shimmering with tears. My grandmother rose, raising her champagne glass. This wedding is not just about 2 people, Eleanor said, her voice steady, carrying across the garden. It's about 2 families finally finding their way back to the truth. It's about a daughter who refused to accept a lie, and a mother who waited 28 years to be believed. She looked at me, then at Rachel, then at Diane. To truth, she said. However long it takes. To truth, the room echoed, and I raised my glass, drinking to that. The lawsuit took 8 months. Rachel and I filed jointly against St. Mary's Hospital, represented by a medical malpractice attorney my grandmother had found. A woman with a reputation for wrongful birth cases and a particular disdain for institutions that thought they could bury their mistakes. Margaret Sullivan testified, her notarized statement reinforced by the original shift log she had kept hidden for 28 years. The weight of decades of silence, of cover-ups and lies, finally came into the light. The hospital's lawyers tried every tactic to discredit Margaret Sullivan, her age, her NDA, the decades-long delay in speaking out, but it didn't work. Internal documents surfaced during discovery. Emails between administrators discussing the incident, memos about risk mitigation, a budget line item quietly renewed every year since 1997 labeled, potential liability settlement. They had known. They always had. And they had spent nearly 30 years hoping no one would ever find out. In the end, the hospital settled rather than face a jury, $450,000 to each family, a public apology printed in the local paper, mandatory improvements to newborn identification protocols, and the resignation of the administrator who had ordered the cover-up, long retired but now publicly named. We didn't sue for revenge, I told a reporter on the courthouse steps. We sued so no other family would spend 28 years living a lie that a hospital could have corrected in a single day. Margaret Sullivan was granted immunity for her cooperation. A few days later she sent me a card, her handwriting shaky but clear. Thank you for giving me a reason to finally tell the truth. I can sleep now that I kept it in a drawer with my birth certificate, the real one. The one that said 11:58 p.m. The one that told the truth. 6 months after the wedding, Gerald asked to meet me for dinner. Just the 2 of us. He chose a quiet Italian restaurant in downtown Hartford, a corner booth with checkered tablecloths, candles flickering, wine bottles lined up on the table. No country club, no show of wealth, just simple, understated. Gerald looked smaller somehow, grayer, as if the weight of his decades of suspicion and the truth he had finally faced had physically worn him down. I wanted to thank you, he said after we ordered. You're not my biological father, I said gently. You never were. But you did raise me, even if you did it badly. He flinched at that but nodded. I'm in therapy now, he admitted. Diane insisted. We're trying couples counseling too. We've been separated, but we're trying to see if there's anything left to save. I thought of my mother, how she had stood in front of him at the engagement party, demanding the apology she had earned, the strength it must have taken to consider rebuilding a life with him after everything.